She walked into the forge at Forge Hollow with a split lip she'd covered as best she could with flour dust, and a resolve that had finally, after 3 years, hardened past the point of bending back. Ruth Calloway had never in her life proposed anything to anyone, let alone a marriage, but she stood in the doorway of Amos Riker's smithy with the hammering still shivering in the hot air, and said it plain before her courage could fail her. "Mr. Riker, I've come to ask if you'd marry me." Amos set down his tongs very slowly, as though giving himself a moment to be certain he had heard her rightly. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders in the way forge work built a man over years, with a quiet, weathered face that gave away almost nothing. And Ruth had chosen him for precisely that reason. Not because she imagined herself in love with him, for she barely knew him beyond nods exchanged at church, and the sound of his hammer carrying across town at all hours, but because he was, by every account Hollow offered, the one man in the county who minded his own business, kept his temper leashed, and would not think to raise a hand to a wife the way her brother raised his to a sister. He said nothing for a long moment, only looked at her, at the flour dust that didn't quite hide the swelling at her mouth, at the way her hands twisted the strap of her carpet bag, and something in his still, careful face shifted, though he did not yet speak. "You don't know me," he said finally, his voice low and rough from disuse, a voice that clearly did not get much daily exercise. "Why me?" "Because you're the only man in this town I've never once heard raise his voice," Ruth said. "And because I haven't got time to court a stranger proper, Mr. Riker. My brother means to marry me off to Cobb Wexler inside the fortnight to settle a gambling debt, and I'd sooner marry a blacksmith I've spoken 10 words to than a man who buys wives to cover his cards." Amos was quiet again, longer this time, and Ruth felt her carefully built resolve begin, despite everything, to waver, felt the old fear rising that she had misjudged him after all, that every man eventually showed the same cruelty given the excuse. Then he wiped his hands on his apron, slow and deliberate, and said the words that would change the whole shape of both their lives. "All right." All right. Ruth had prepared arguments, explanations, even if it came to it, an offer to work the forge accounts in exchange for the shelter of his name. She had not prepared for a man simply to agree. "All right," Amos said again, and something that might, in a more talkative man, have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I'll marry you, Miss Calloway. Reckon a woman brave enough to walk in here and ask plain deserves a plain answer back." Ruth had not always lived under her brother's fist. Their parents had run a modest freight way station outside Forge Hollow, and for the first 20 years of her life, Ruth had known nothing worse than an ordinary hard-working household, warm enough, plain enough, entirely without cruelty in it. It was the fever that took both her mother and father inside the same terrible month that had changed everything, leaving the way station and its debts to Dade as the elder, and leaving Ruth, 3 years his junior and without means of her own, dependent on whatever mercy her brother chose to show her. He had shown less of it every season since. The drinking had started slow, the cards faster, and somewhere in the second year of his mismanagement, he had discovered that a sister too frightened to leave was a convenient target for the frustrations his failures bred in him. Ruth had gone twice to the county seat to ask after other kin who might take her in, and found, both times, that her mother's people had scattered west years before and her father's had none to spare. There had been no one. Until, on a morning when the split lip had finally outweighed every fear she carried about striking out alone, she had remembered the quiet blacksmith who never raised his voice, even when a customer shorted him on payment, and had walked the whole distance into town on legs that trembled with something other than cold. Amos Riker had not expected, when he woke that morning to the ordinary business of banked coals and cold iron, that he would end the day engaged to be married. He had long since made peace with the notion that he would live out his days alone above the smithy his father had built, a man too quiet for courting. And if he was honest with himself in the dark hours when honesty came easiest, too scarred by an old betrayal to trust his own judgment where women were concerned. 7 years before, a girl named Prudence Alden had let him court her the better part of a year, and then married a cattle buyer from the county seat, the very week Amos worked up the nerve to propose, and he had drawn a lesson from that humiliation that had held fast ever since, that a silent man with a forge for company was safer, on the whole, than a man who let himself hope for more. He remembered still, with a clarity he wished would fade, the particular way the whole town had watched him that season, the pitying looks after church, Prudence's new husband's careless laughter carrying across the street the day the couple came back to Forge Hollow to visit her people, and Amos, hammering iron alone in his forge, hearing that laughter and understanding it was aimed, at least in part, at the quiet man who'd been too slow and too plain to keep her. He had closed himself off after that with the same deliberate care. He brought to banking a forge fire for the night, enough warmth left to keep the coals alive, but nothing left exposed enough to catch and burn a man again. But there was something in the way Ruth Calloway had stood in his doorway, not weeping, not pleading, simply stating her need plain and waiting to see if he was decent enough to meet it, that had cracked something loose in him he hadn't known was still capable of moving. He had seen the bruise she'd tried to hide. He had heard, same as every soul in Forge Hollow, the whispers about Dade Calloway's temper and his cards and the particular cruelty he saved for his sister, since their parents' deaths had left her dependent on his goodwill. Amos had never once considered it his business to interfere in another man's household. He found, standing there with his tongs set down and a strange, unfamiliar warmth moving through his chest, that he no longer cared whether it was his business or not. They were married 4 days later by the circuit preacher, in a ceremony so quick and quiet that half the town only learned of it after the fact, over supper, from someone who'd happened to be walking past the church. Ruth wore her mother's good gray dress, let out at the seams and pressed carefully the night before, and carried a small handful of late summer asters she'd picked herself along the creek road, since there had been no time and less money for anything finer. Amos stood beside her in his one good shirt, scrubbed clean of forge soot for the occasion, and when the preacher asked whether he took Ruth Calloway to be his wife, he answered, "I do," in a voice steady enough that Ruth, watching him from beneath her lashes, felt for the first time a small, unfamiliar flutter of something that was not merely relief at her own rescue. Dade Calloway was not invited, and did not come looking for his sister until the following week, by which time Ruth had already moved her few belongings into the small rooms above the smithy and begun, with the careful economy of a woman used to making do, to turn Amos Riker's bachelor quarters into something resembling a home. He came on a Thursday evening, reeking of whiskey and fury both, and hammered on the smithy door hard enough to rattle the tools hung inside. "Ruth," Dade's voice carried clear down the street, drawing more than one curtain aside in the houses nearby. "You come out here. You've made me the laughingstock of this whole county, running off to marry some deaf-mute blacksmith without so much as a word to your own kin." Amos was not deaf, and had never in his life been mute, only careful with his words, but he let the insult pass without comment, coming to stand in the doorway with his considerable frame filling most of it, blocking Dade's view of the stairs behind him where Ruth stood frozen, one hand pressed white-knuckled to the banister. "She's my wife now," Amos said, quiet and even. "Whatever business you've got with her, you'll settle it through me. This is family business, not yours." Dade swayed slightly, one hand braced against the doorframe. "She owes me. Our father's place, the debt's on it. She's got no right running off and leaving me to answer for what's rightly a family obligation." "Seems to me," Amos said, "the only obligation your sister owed was to stay alive in a house where you'd taken to using your fists on her, and I'd wager any judge in this territory would agree, should it come to that. Go home, Dade. Sleep it off. And don't come back to my door reeking of whiskey and shouting my wife's name in the street, or I'll not be so patient the second time." Dade left, cursing, but Ruth, watching from the stairs with her heart hammering, understood that this was not the last she would see of her brother's fury. Dade Calloway was not a man who let go of what he considered his easily, and the debts he owed Cobb Wexler had not vanished simply because his planned solution had walked out his door. Ruth found, in the weeks that followed, that married life with a silent man suited her better than she'd expected, though it was not without its own quiet trials. Amos rarely spoke more than a dozen words at a stretch, and Ruth, raised in a household where every silence had eventually curdled into shouting, found herself at first straining to read meaning into his quiet the way she'd once had to read the warning signs in her brother's moods. It took her the better part of a month to understand that Amos's silence held no threat in it at all, that when he said nothing over supper, it was simply because he had nothing pressing to say, and that his quiet was, if anything, the safest place she had ever stood. "You don't have to watch me like that," he told her once, catching the wary flicker in her eyes when he set down his fork harder than he'd meant to. "I know what you're braced for. I'm not your brother, Ruth. I never will be." "I know that," she said, though her voice shook slightly with the admission. "I'm sorry. It's an old habit, watching a man's hands and his face for what's coming. I don't seem to be able to put it down all at once, even knowing you're nothing like him." "Take whatever time you need to put it down," Amos said. "I'm not in any hurry." It was, Ruth thought later, one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to her, precisely because it asked nothing of her in return. The town, for its part, took its time deciding what to make of the sudden marriage. Mrs. Foss, who ran the mercantile and considered herself the keeper of Forge Hollow's opinions, cornered Ruth over a bolt of calico her second week as a wife and remarked, with the particular relish of a woman fishing for scandal, that it was awfully convenient timing, wasn't it? A girl fleeing her brother's house landing so neatly in a bachelor blacksmith's bed, and didn't Ruth think folks might wonder at the haste of it? "Folks are welcome to wonder whatever they like, Mrs. Foss," Ruth said, meeting the woman's eyes without flinching, a steadiness she was only beginning to discover she possessed. "I asked Mr. Riker to marry me because my own brother had taken to using his fists on me, and Mr. Riker was decent enough to say yes without demanding I explain myself twice. If that scandalizes anyone, I expect they've led easier lives than I have, and I'm glad of it for their sake." Mrs. Foss had no ready answer for that, and word of the exchange traveled through Forge Hollow faster than the marriage itself had, turning at least a portion of the town's curiosity into something closer to respect. By the time autumn set in, more than one neighbor woman had taken to greeting Ruth warmly at church, and old Mrs. Pemberton, who'd known Amos's late mother, told Ruth outright one Sunday that she was glad to see the boy finally happy, since he'd gone entirely too many years quiet and alone after that Alden business, and it did a body good to see him smiling again. There were harder nights, too, that no amount of the town's gradual warming could smooth away. Ruth woke some weeks into the marriage from a dream of her brother's raised hand, gasping, halfway out of the bed before she'd fully surfaced from sleep, and found Amos already awake beside her, still, careful, making no move to reach for her. "You're safe," he said quietly from his own side of the bed, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him but not so close as to crowd her. "Whatever you dreamed, it isn't here, Ruth. You don't have to run from anything in this house." "I know," she said, though her voice shook. "My body seems to know it slower than my mind does." "Bodies take their own time learning what's safe," Amos said. "Mine took the better part of 2 years to stop flinching every time a woman so much as smiled at me kindly, after Prudence. I'll not rush you toward trusting anything faster than it comes natural." And he stayed exactly where he was, not reaching for her, not demanding comfort in return for the comfort he offered, until her breathing steadied, and she found her own way, in her own time, to close the last small distance between them herself. Amos, for his part, found himself surprised almost daily by the woman who had walked so boldly into his forge and proposed. Ruth kept his books with a sharper eye than he'd ever managed himself, mended his one good shirt without being asked, and had a low, unexpected laugh that he found himself, more and more, contriving small excuses to earn. He had married her, in the beginning, purely out of the plain decency of sheltering a woman from a violent home. He had not expected to find himself, some 6 weeks into the arrangement, standing at his forge in the middle of the afternoon thinking of the particular way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating on a column of figures, and feeling something that had nothing at all to do with decency and everything to do with a slow, quiet, entirely unlooked-for kind of love. He did not say any of this aloud, because saying things aloud had never come easily to him, and because he was not yet certain Ruth wanted more from their arrangement than the safety it had been built to provide. Instead he began, in the hours after the forge closed for the evening, to work on something he told her only was a project, out behind the smithy on a strip of land he owned along the creek, and would not let her come see until it was further along. "A man's entitled to his secrets," he told her, when she pressed him, with the closest thing to teasing he'd yet managed in their short marriage. "You'll see it when it's ready." They did not stay quiet for long. Cobb Wexler, it turned out, had grown considerably less patient about his debt once the marriage that was meant to settle it had gone instead to another man entirely, and by the second month Dade had begun appearing around town at odd hours, watching the smithy from across the street, once cornering Ruth outside the mercantile to hiss that she'd best find a way to send some of her new husband's money his way if she knew what was good for either of them. Ruth told Amos everything, because she had decided, early in their marriage, that secrets kept out of fear were the very habit she meant to leave behind with her brother's house. Amos listened, said little, and rode into town the following day to speak with the sheriff about the debt, the threats, and the particular danger a desperate man with a gambling habit and a grudge could pose to a household. The sheriff, a practical man named Otis Cray, promised to keep half an eye on Dade's movements, though he allowed, honestly, that half an eye was about all his small office could spare. It was not enough. 2 weeks after the sheriff's promise, Ruth came out one morning to find the smithy's front window shattered and a crude, threatening note weighted down with a stone on the step, unsigned but unmistakable in its meaning, warning that debts owed by kin didn't simply vanish because a woman had found herself a new husband to hide behind. Amos swept the glass without comment, boarded the window that same afternoon, and rode into town again to press Sheriff Cray for more than half an eye, this time only to be told, not unkindly, that a broken window and an unsigned note weren't enough, under the law as it stood, to justify locking a man up before he'd done worse. "He'll do worse," Amos said flatly, and the sheriff, to his credit, did not disagree, only repeated that his hands were tied until Dade gave him better cause. Amos rode home turning the problem over the whole way, and began, that same week, sleeping with the shotgun close at hand and teaching Ruth, in the quiet hour after supper, how to load and aim it herself, not because he doubted his own ability to protect her, but because he had learned enough of her spirit by then to know she would rather stand ready beside him than be sheltered blind behind a locked door. "I hope I never have cause to use it," Ruth said, turning the weight of the gun over in her hands that first evening, feeling the strangeness of it against a life spent believing a woman's only choice was to endure or to run. "So do I," Amos said, "but I'd rather you knew how than not and be caught wishing you did." It was not enough. 3 weeks later, on a night when Amos had ridden out to deliver a repaired wagon axle to a farm 5 miles distant and was not expected back before full dark, Dade Calloway came to the smithy with Cobb Wexler and a third man Ruth didn't recognize. All three of them liquored up and past reasoning, and pounded on the door with considerably more violence than the Thursday visit months before. "Open up, Ruth." Dade's voice had lost whatever restraint the earlier daylight visits had held. "Wexler here says your husband's got money put by, enough to clear what's owed. You're going to open this door and see us paid, or we'll come in and take it ourselves." Ruth's first instinct, honed by years under her brother's roof, was the old cold fear that told her to go silent and small and hope the storm passed over without striking her directly. Her second instinct, hard-won these past months of Amos's steady, undemanding kindness, was fury, a clean, bright anger at the notion that these men believed they could simply take whatever they decided was owed them. From her, from her husband, from anyone too small to stop them. She did not open the door. She barred it instead, dragged the heavy oak table across it for good measure, and went for the shotgun Amos kept mounted above the mantel for exactly such an occasion, though she had never in her life fired it and prayed she would not have to learn tonight. The door held under the first assault, splintering at the hinge but not giving, and Ruth's hands shook as she leveled the shotgun at the widening crack, her voice, when it came, steadier than she felt. "I'll not open this door, Dade, and if you break it down, know that I'll defend my home. I'm done being afraid of you. I've been done since the day I walked out." "You'll defend nothing, you foolish girl. You've never fired a gun in your—" Whatever Dade meant to finish saying was lost beneath the sound of a horse coming hard up the street, and a moment later Amos's voice, low and furious in a way Ruth had never once heard it, cut through the night air like a struck bell. "Get away from my door." Amos had smelled the trouble before he'd seen it, smoke of a different kind than his forge produced, the particular charge in the air that came off men working themselves toward violence, and had ridden the last mile at a dead run on instinct alone, some part of him already knowing, with a certainty he could not have explained, that Ruth was in danger. He came off his horse before it had fully stopped and put himself between the three men and his own splintered door, with the flat, unhurried menace of a man who had spent 20 years shaping iron with his bare hands, and did not, in this single moment, feel inclined toward gentleness. "This is between us and the girl's own kin," Dade said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado at the sight of Amos's size and the cold, controlled fury in his face. "Stay out of it, Blacksmith." "She's my wife," Amos said, "which makes it entirely between you and me now, and I'll tell you plain what I told you the first time you came sniffing around my door drunk and shouting. Leave. Now. Or I'll finish what your own conscience should have started years ago and put you flat on your back in the street where you belong." The third man, the one Ruth had never learned the name of, had already begun backing toward his horse the moment Amos rode up, wanting no part of a quarrel that had never truly been his to begin with. And it was in the sudden thinning of his numbers that Dade seemed to sense his advantage slipping, his face twisting with the particular desperation of a man who has run out of every option but the worst one. Cobb Wexler, sober enough despite the whiskey to recognize a fight he stood to lose badly, caught Dade's arm. "This isn't worth it, Calloway. Not against a man his size. Not for a debt she was never good collateral for in the first place." But Dade, past reason and past caring for his own safety, lunged instead for the door, perhaps hoping to reach Ruth before Amos could stop him. And the two men came together in the street in a brief, brutal scuffle that ended, within a handful of seconds, with Dade flat on his back in the dust, Amos's knee planted on his chest, and one large hand fisted, unmoving, in the front of his shirt. "I could break every bone in your worthless hand," Amos said, low and terrible, "for every time you raised it against your own sister. I won't, because she doesn't need a husband who solves things with his fists any more than she needed a brother who did. But you'll hear me plain, Dade Calloway. You come near this smithy again, near my wife, near anything that's mine, and I'll not be so restrained the next time. Do you understand me?" Dade, staring up into a face gone hard as forged iron, understood well enough. He and Wexler and the third man left Forge Hollow before dawn, and were not seen in the county again. Word reaching town some weeks later that Dade had drifted west, still running from Wexler's debt, still, so far as anyone knew, no better a man than he'd ever been. Ruth came out into the street, once the men had gone, the shotgun still trembling in her hands, and found Amos turning to her with an expression she had never yet seen on his careful, guarded face. Something raw and unguarded and entirely without its usual armor. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with a fear he'd kept banked the whole ride back. "Barring the door, holding that gun, Ruth, if I'd been 5 minutes later." "But you weren't," Ruth said, and set the shotgun down against the ruined doorframe and closed the distance between them. And this time it was she who reached for him, her hands fisting in the front of his shirt the same way his had fisted in her brother's. "You came. You always come, Amos, every single time it's mattered, and I think I've been too frightened of my own heart these past months to tell you what that's meant to me." "Tell me now," Amos said, low, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the violence just past, the same hands that moments before had held a grown man flat against the dust of the street. "I've got nothing but time, and I find I'd very much like to hear it." "I married you to escape my brother," Ruth said. "I'll not pretend otherwise, not to you, not after everything. But somewhere in these past months, watching you be patient with me, watching you build whatever secret thing you're building down by the creek, watching you just now put yourself between me and 3 armed men without a moment's hesitation, I stopped needing an escape, Amos. I started needing you instead. I love you. I don't know when it happened exactly, but it's happened, plain and whole, and I'd have married you again tomorrow even if my brother had never existed to chase me toward your door." Amos, a man who had spent 7 years believing himself too quiet and too scarred for a woman's whole heart, found he had, for once, no shortage of words at all. "I loved you before you finished asking me to marry you," he admitted. "Stood there in my own forge with my tongs still hot in my hand, and felt something in me wake up that I'd thought was long since dead and buried. I've been building that house down by the creek because I wanted you to have a home that was entirely your own. Ruth, not rooms above my father's smithy, not shelter from your brother, but a true home, built new, with nothing of anyone else's cruelty anywhere in its walls. I meant to finish it and bring you down to see it and ask you properly, the way I should have asked in the first place, whether you'd stay with me not out of need but out of choice." "Show me," Ruth said, laughing through the tears that had risen without her quite noticing. "Show me now, Amos. I find I don't want to wait another day for it, secret or no secret." He led her down through the dark to the creek land, lanterns swinging between them, and there in the moonlight stood the frame of a house near finished, 2 rooms already roofed, a wide porch facing the water, the whole structure built with the same patient, careful strength Amos brought to every piece of iron he ever shaped. Ruth walked its unfinished floor slowly, running her fingers along a windowsill Amos had planed smooth by hand, along a doorframe cut wide enough, he admitted with some embarrassment, for his own broad shoulders to pass through without turning sideways the way he had to in the smithy's cramped stairwell. She found, in the corner of what would become the kitchen, a small shelf built at just the height she liked to keep her mother's one surviving china cup, though she had never once mentioned the cup or its preferred resting place aloud, and understood that Amos had been watching her far more closely, all these quiet months, than his silence had ever let on. Ruth stood before the unfinished hearth with her hand pressed to her mouth, and understood that this quiet man had spent 2 months of stolen evening hours building her, with his own 2 hands, the first home of her life that no one could ever take from her or use against her. "It isn't finished," Amos said, almost apologetic, one hand rubbing the back of his neck in the way she'd learned meant he was more nervous than his steady voice let on. "Another month, maybe 2, before it's fit to live in proper. I'd meant to have the whole of it done before I ever brought you down here, roof and hearth and every last board in place, so you'd have nothing to do but walk in and call it yours entire. Seems my patience ran out faster than my lumber did." "It's the finest thing anyone has ever built for me," Ruth said, her voice thick, and turned to him with her whole heart plain on her face for the first time since she'd walked into his forge a stranger with nothing but a bruised lip and a desperate proposal to her name. "Finish it with me beside you, Amos. Let me help you raise the last of it, the way I ought to have been helping all along instead of only watching from a distance." They finished the house together that autumn, with half of Forge Hollow turning out to help raise the final walls once word got around what quiet, steady Amos Riker had been building all those secretive evenings. Mrs. Foss brought a ham for the raising day supper, without being asked, and old Mrs. Pemberton cried openly at the sight of the finished porch, declaring it the finest piece of building she'd seen in the county, since Amos's own father had put up the smithy 30 years before. Even Sheriff Cray rode out to lend a hand with the roof shingles, remarking to Amos, low, that he was glad the matter with Dade Calloway had settled itself the way it had, without needing the law's slower justice to see it done. By the time the first snow came, Ruth Calloway Riker stood in her own kitchen in her own home, with a fire built up warm against the coming winter, and a husband beside her who had never once, in all the months since she'd walked boldly into his forge and proposed, raised anything against her but a hammer, a house frame, and eventually, a glass in a toast to the wife who had chosen him first and loved him after, in an order neither of them had expected but both of them, in the end, would not have traded for any other kind of beginning. Amos took to telling the story himself, in later years, on the rare evenings he could be coaxed into more than a dozen words at a stretch. How his wife had walked into his forge a stranger with a proposal instead of a courtship, and how it had taken him the better part of a heartbeat to understand she was the finest thing that had ever crossed his threshold, and the whole rest of his life to be sufficiently grateful for it.